and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about I regret paying down debt. A really interesting case study of an investor who paid off a lot of his own mortgage and ended up regretting it later. And I want to tell you the reason why. So this investor owned an investment property and it was worth about $800,000 and it had a small mortgage on it, about $550K. And what they thought is, we don't want this investment property anymore. And they actually did a really good thing. They sold it at the top of the market, and after paying their real estate agent, ripped out about $200,000, just over. And they thought, okay, we've got this 200 odd K. We don't want to go and buy an investment property right now, which was smart. It was the top of the market, but we're going to wait. And so they thought, well, what are we going to do with this $200,000 we've got from selling this property? And they thought, okay, let's pay it off the mortgage on our own home. Now, this was a really interesting case because they had about $1 million home and the mortgage was $800,000. And at today's interest rate, the mortgage repayments were quite high.
Yeah, and so I'm guessing that probably the previous house was their own house originally. Would that be right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Then they turned it into a rental, ended up selling later. And they thought, okay, here's what we're going to do with that 200K. We're going to pay off our mortgage, or we're going to pay it down to bring our weekly mortgage repayment down as well. And they thought, well, in future, what we'll do, because we still want to buy an investment property, but when we feel it's the right time, we will borrow against this house. And then what we'll do is we'll be able to borrow that money back that we've paid it down and go and buy an investment property. Now, with those numbers, their $1 million own home with the 800K mortgage, they wouldn't be able to borrow any money against that property. But if they pay off the mortgage by 200 grand, they actually would be able to borrow that 200K back for that deposit for an investment property a little bit later on. So what happened in that scenario, Andrew?
So they did the right thing. They paid down their mortgage and that reduced their repayment to $816 a week. So that's a $290 savings. It's great. So better cash flow, lower bad debt, their personal debt. So overall, that sounds like exactly what I would think that someone would do.
And of course, at the point they did that, they then have $210,000 of usable equity within their own home. They can borrow against that money, pull out a deposit for a potential investment property. And, you know, at today's loan to value ratio restrictions, Andrew, what could they get for that?
They could buy a new build investment property for just over $1 million, or they could buy an existing property for about $600,000.
Okay, so that sounds pretty good. It sounds like they've done a good thing. Their mortgage repayments gone down, so they're saving money on interest costs. On top of that, the money is still there and available for an investment property. But since then, Auckland property prices have fallen by about 22%. So 18 months later, their property that was worth $1 million, what's it worth now, Andrew?
It's down to $780,000.
Now, they've also paid off some of their mortgage over that time. It's gone down by about $11,000. Now, of course, their mortgage repayment is the same. But the issue is, what has happened to their usable equity? What's happened to their ability to buy an investment property?
So because, again, they can only borrow 80% of the value of their property. It's today's value of the property. So now their usable equity has gone from $210,000 to $45,000.
So that's the deposit they can access within their own home. Now, what are they going to be able to get for that, Andrew?
Well, if they buy a new build, they could spend up to $225,000. Unrealistic. And if they buy an existing property, $128,000.
And so that's where I know that this property investor, when I was speaking with them, said, I regret paying down debt because previously he would have been able to purchase an investment property, or if he did some things differently, he still would have been able to purchase an investment property. Now he's not able to do it. But before we get into that, Andrew, why did paying down debt feel like the right decision to make at that time?
Oh, because that's what we're told to do. So let's think about this. He had a massive personal mortgage, and that's bad debt. Like, we always call this bad debt because, yeah, it gives you somewhere to live, but it's not attached to an income generating asset. So we want to do everything we can to pay down our bad debt. When you get an extra couple of $100,000, great, let's apply that to the bad debt because we want to reduce that personal mortgage. And it gives you a peace of mind, lower repayments, that hedges against higher interest rates. But when that value came down, we've got to remember that our house is not liquid. So we've locked up that money in an illiquid asset. And now it's a problem because they can't buy at now the bottom of the market, right?
Well, the good news is that he didn't take that money and purchase an investment property at the peak of the market. So in retrospect, that looks like a really smart thing to have done, even though there are a lot of people, myself included, who did end up purchasing at the peak of the market, and property values, of course, have gone down, but that's just dumb me. But I think the bad thing about this is he's missed out that opportunity to purchase while property prices are low. And that's why he's kicking himself, feeling that regret, I guess, because he sold an asset down, that investment property, and he now wants to replace that asset. He sold one investment property. He wants to get another one because that's going to help him out to build a property portfolio in the future, to sort of out for retirement, potentially help build that passive income.
And look, I think the thing to remember here is, yes, paying off the bad debt is the right thing to do most of the time, but you maybe need to be a bit more strategic because you don't want all of your cash tied up in a non-income producing asset, i.e. your home. Yes, you want to reduce your mortgage, reduce your repayments, get out of debt, but you might have to, if you're wanting to grow a portfolio or you're wanting to build assets outside of your own home, you might need to be a little strategic around how you do that, because this decision, the way that he's done it, has cost him the ability to buy in a down market.
So let's talk about some alternative scenarios then, because there's going to be a lot of people listening or watching this who's going to think, well, what was the alternative? How else could he have played this situation?
Okay, so I talked about liquidity before, so I would be doing something that kept my cash liquid. Now, what you don't want to do is park that money in a savings account and get 3% on it that's taxed while you're paying 6% on your mortgage. That's just dumb. But what you could do is structure your mortgage so that $210,000 of it, for example, is on an offset. Now, what that means is you'll pay interest on the net position of your mortgage. So if you've got a mortgage of $210 and you've got cash of $210, you'll pay interest on zero. Or you could use a revolving credit if your bank doesn't have an offset mortgage.
So effectively, what you're talking about is if he set up this offset or revolving credit account, offset would probably be better, that he could have effectively had the benefit of paying off the debt.
Yes.
But if he wanted to, he could still take that money out at any time without asking the bank.
Correct. And look, it's quite a hard concept, I know, for older investors to get their head around because it's so ingrained in us to pay down debt. Now, like you said before, you can get the benefit of paying down that debt without the disadvantage of that money being tied up in the mortgage by using an offset. And the fact that you can take that out at will without having to ask the bank's permission, that's what's golden about a revolving credit or an offset mortgage.
And what that would allow this investor to do is still take out that deposit when they felt that it was the right time to buy. Now, it would be remiss of us if we didn't point out that if he had a property price of $780,000 and he still had that mortgage of about $800K, by the time he took that money back out of the offset, then the mortgage would be larger than the property price. He would have negative equity within that property. But why might somebody still make that decision?
Well, the reason is if he goes and takes out, say he buys $1 million investment property and puts $200K worth of deposit into that, well, he's going to have the same level of debt. It's just structured differently. So it still allows him to take advantage of the market right now, which I think there's some absolute benefits of the market right now. And look, this is going to be at a bank away from his existing house. So it doesn't stop him from proceeding with adding to his asset base. The mortgage and his net position is identical either scenario.
I think the main thing that people have to realise in this situation is there will be Kiwis out there watching this who say, that would be way too much debt for me. I wouldn't want to do what this Kiwi actually would want to do in this scenario, which is take on way more debt at a time when interest rates are high just to take advantage of lower house prices. That's cool. The great thing about investing is we all have a different approach to risk. Now, this particular person is quite risk-seeking and is saying, you know what? I'm young. I'm keen to do this. I'm going to go ahead and take on as much debt as possible so that I can try and grow my assets over a 30 or 40-year period. This would not be the right fit for somebody who was older and is closer to retirement and would need to think differently about taking on debt. But one thing that I do want to point out is that this is all about whether you trigger a credit assessment or not. So some people will be listening to this, Andrew, and be thinking, okay, so if I put all of this money in an offset account and I can take it out at any time, but then my house value goes down, isn't the bank going to say something when I take that $200,000 out and my mortgage is larger than the value of my house?
Yeah, no. So long as you don't trigger a credit assessment where the bank's going to reassess your lending position, you're not going to have an issue. So you need to continue to make your mortgage payments, obviously. But if you're having that conversation, like if they go into the bank now, that triggers a credit assessment, and the bank says, "Look, I'm sorry, you can't borrow that money." But if they'd had that credit assessment back when the house was worth $1 million and got that 200K worth of offset, bank's got no problem with that.
And so does that mean that they wouldn't be able to go into the bank and ask to get something like a credit card, a personal loan, any other type of credit or loan type of product?
No, they can do unsecured, but if they do anything with their mortgage, that's where it becomes a different story.
Does that even include if they were to lock in a new interest rate?
No, they can lock in a new interest rate.
So the main thing that if this person was to get in the time machine, go back to the peak of the market and set this up, the really important thing to do is once they had the money in the offset account, they would then need to make sure that they don't go back to the bank and apply to extend the term, that they don't apply to do anything to that mortgage, because if the value of the property's gone back, what could happen to that money in the offset account, Andrew?
Oh, they can't actually just take that and make them pay it off the mortgage. They won't necessarily do that. No.
Well, I've done it in other situations.
Well, they'll do that if you're discharging a security, then they'll take the money because they've got control of that money at that stage. But if you structure it right then, I mean, they'll say no to anything like an interest-only term or an extension of your term, but you can refix your mortgage. They can't take that money once it's already approved.
Oh, that's interesting because that's a bit different to some other situations we've talked about in the podcast, where if you're selling a property, then the bank might take some of that money and force you to pay down debt even without asking you.
If you're with commercial, so like with me, then they can have annual reviews and look at your LVR and stuff like that. But in a situation like that, no.
So the good thing about this is, had this investor set it up the way that we're suggesting that they probably would have liked to for their goals, then they could have had the benefit of the lower mortgage. And then when they decide that it was the right time to invest, they could rip that money out, go to another bank across the road and use that money as the deposit for whatever property, whatever investment property they wanted to buy. Now, of course, if they tried to get the mortgage from the same bank they had this mortgage with, it never would have happened because they wouldn't have enough equity. So this is where it's really important. I think this is the lesson here, is sometimes you'll see videos on YouTube, or you will listen to podcasts on Spotify or Apple, or read a blog online, and the top 5 things to do to improve your finances: pay down your mortgage.
Yeah.
Well, that may not actually be the correct advice for what you want to do. Now, most of the time, paying down debt typically is the right decision, especially if it's bad debt, if it's bubblegum debt, those kinds of things. And we've got other videos and podcasts that try and say what is good debt, what is bad debt. But sometimes that's actually not the right decision. If your primary goal is to build an investment portfolio, as it was for this investor, actually paying down debt led that person to then say, I actually regret doing that because now I'm not actually able to achieve my financial goal because I decided to pay down debt. And that's why it's really interesting, because sometimes paying off your mortgage faster is actually not the right financial decision for you. Sometimes having more debt could be the right financial decision if your primary goal is to build an investment portfolio.
And I think it's important that we do state that, remember, we're just talking generally here. So this is one of those situations where we should say, this is generally what you would do if you're wanting to build a portfolio, but you should talk to a financial advisor if you're going to make a decision like this.
Well, whenever you're taking out debt, I think that's probably the right thing to do, is talk
Yes.
to a financial advisor. But in this specific situation, this is what this investor would have rather have done rather than pay down debt. And I think that's what's often missed in that kind of online Facebook discussion. Because,
or your dad giving you advice.
Well, it's because sometimes simple decisions that seem quite obvious, that seem to make sense, like paying down debt, can actually have a large impact on your financial life. And that's why you'll want to speak with a good mortgage advisor, not someone who specializes in first homes. If this is what you want to do and you want to grow a portfolio, working with a mortgage advisor who specializes in investment properties, that's where you are going to get the right advice tailored for you. So, Andrew, when should somebody pay off debt and when should they not?
Look, I think that absolutely paying down debt is the right thing to do as a general sense. But if you're wanting to build a portfolio of rental properties over the next wee while, then you might use things like an offset instead. So again, you get the benefit of paying down debt, but you've still got some liquidity there as well.
Especially if you get a large inheritance or you sell an investment property. So if you get a lump of cash and you want to grow a portfolio in the future, then using something like an offset, keeping it liquid, could be something to consider, something to talk to your mortgage advisor about.
So I've just started working with some investors who earn really, really high income. They've got a relatively big mortgage in Auckland, and what they're doing is they've actually structured their mortgage on 30 years because they're young and they're thinking, well, if we pay it off in 30 years, great, we'll probably pay it off faster than that. What they've done is they've structured a big chunk of their mortgage on revolving credit, and they pay that down, and every time they pay it down, they take it back out and put a deposit down on a rental property.
Classic mortgage buster strategy. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you're listening to the audio version of this and want to check out the spreadsheet that we were sharing, just head to our YouTube channel. If you Google Opus Partners YouTube, it'll be one of the first things that comes up. And if you're already watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe. We release new videos every Monday and Wednesday. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicholl.
We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.